and Richard Wellington came to us from England. And so we appreciate the travels they've made in order to come speak to us. We did put an article about him in the radio magazine. It caught quite a stir. We probably got more hits on our website from that article than many we put up in a long time. So we really appreciate that. I also want to mention right up front that if you like what you hear, they're also going to be speaking. I have my glasses on. Friday evening, August 8th, 7 to 9 p.m., the 6th to 8th LDS War Chapel, which is at 300 North, 100 East, and American Fork. So that's Friday, 7 to 9, American Fork, 300 North, 100 East. They're going to talk more about this and put on a longer presentation. So we'll get just a taste of what they have. And to give them more time, I'm just going to turn it over to them.
Thank you, Scott and Bear. I'm Lord Poppers. She wasn't sure. And I live in the peaceful land of Saudi Arabia. I'm president of the Nephi Project. It's a group of LDS and non-LDS who are still doing some research on Lehi's Trail in Arabia. We're going to pass down for the rows a little card here. If you'd like to receive an email newsletter from us, it's free. Please sign it and send it back down the aisle. Thank you, Vicki. Now, I'd also go to our website, which is nephiproject.com, and see what we've been doing over there. It's really an honor for me to speak to you today because I have my partner here. It's the first time in the U.S. I've ever had a chance to do a presentation with my exploring partner and dear friend, Richard Wellington. And so I really, a real privilege for me. Now, what were we doing in the northwest corner of Saudi Arabia where research began? We were trying to find the Saudi Arabian or the Arabian candidate for Mount Sinai. And after several attempts, we found the mountain. That led us then to a town called Al-Bada, which is by oral tradition there, the home of Jethro. The assistant to the mayor of the town told us that, if you're really interested in Moses, what you should see is the waters of Moses on the Gulf of Aqaba. So we traveled there, and what we found was a candidate, we would call a qualified candidate for the Valley of Lemuel. Now, why is that important that we find a qualified candidate for the Valley of Lemuel? Well, critics of the Book of Mormon are going to find fault with the Book of Mormon. The obvious place to start is in Jerusalem, because we have a clear point of embarkment on the Book of Mormon account. So it'd be very easy to start there and then follow Nephi's writing and see if it holds up to what's actually there in the desert. Critics have already come out with very strong assertions. For example, there are no rivers in Arabia. How could there be a river of Laman? There never have been any timbers or trees growing in Oman by which Nephi could build a ship. There are geographical errors in the Book of Mormon. On the other hand, if you could prove that First Nephi is an accurate historical account, then it would follow that the rest of the Book of Mormon was divinely inspired. Richard?
It's a pleasure to be here, and George and I haven't had a chance. We've been trying to organise this from thousands of miles apart, so you have to excuse that we're just putting our act together here a little bit. But if you remember, cast your minds back to Lehi's departure from Jerusalem. We're told that he goes into the wilderness, and there are a number of routes that could have taken him to the Gulf of Aqaba, where they end up at the Red Sea, some of which traveled along the western part of the Dead Sea and down to Wadi Araba. But we will just present what we feel, because we don't have time to go into all the details. If you need more, then by all means go into the book. But we feel that they headed here, immediately across the plain of Jericho, and picked up the route which runs down the length of Arabia, which used to be used for trade and so on. There are a number of reasons why we believe that. First of all, we're told that when King Zedekiah, if you remember, when Jerusalem finally fell to Nebuchadnezzar's army as the walls were breached, he fled through the gate that was near his garden, and he fled east, and because that was the quickest way out of Israelite territory, and he was captured on the plains of Jericho. We're also told that many other residents of Judah did the same thing when Nebuchadnezzar's army came. There seems to be a historical precedent for heading east to get away quickly. And Hugh Nibley and others, as pointed out by Kent Brown here, have put together an impressive array of evidence that points to Lehi's exodus as a replication of that of the Israelites. In other words, we believe that one of the reasons why Nephi uses the Exodus as a teaching tool to Lehi and Lemuel so often is because it's a reproduction, it's a mirror of the journey they took, so it was directly relevant to Lehi and Lemuel. The route that we would suggest they took, it takes them here across the north of the Dead Sea. Now, can I just point out this little arrow here, because I'm going to be talking about Wadi el-Qarar in a moment. So when you see the photographs, we're talking about an area about 2 miles north of the Dead Sea and about a mile to the east of River Jordan. As they were heading east from here, they had an opportunity to pick up 2 different roads. One of them was called the King's Highway, and the other one was known as the Way of the Wilderness. The King's Highway, well, in that case, I tell you what, let's just move on to the next picture. If you take a look at the route of the Exodus, this is taken from the maps and the new maps in the LDS scriptures. The route of the Exodus came across the plain of Jericho to pick up the Way of the Wilderness, and then at this portion here came down to join up with the King's Highway, and which eventually brought them down to Ezion Geber, which is on the Gulf of Aqaba. Could this be called travelling in the wilderness? Well, we believe that it certainly could. I mentioned this area known as Wadi el-Qarar, immediately on the north of the Dead Sea. Well, this was the area where John the Baptist was preaching. We are told that he was preaching in the wilderness, and recently the church has been found at Wadi el-Qarar, which marks the place where John the Baptist preached and where Elijah was taken up into heaven. And I had an opportunity to go and visit that. It's in Jordan a few years ago. At that point it wasn't open to the public, but it may well be open now. If any of you ever go to Jordan, you may want to see it. This is the church here, and on the other side of the wadi there's a small building which marks the area where John the Baptist preached. This is where Elijah is meant to have been taken up into heaven. This is according to the Pilgrim of Bordeaux, who wrote about this in 333 AD. So to bring them to the Way of the Wilderness, why would we say they travelled in the Way of the Wilderness? Well, we believe that Lehi, when he departed, used camels. This isn't our idea. Nibley argues very ably to say this. Just the tents they would have lived in would have been far too heavy for a man to carry. And when he travelled by camel, one of the things you were looking for was a route which was flat and where the sand was compacted enough that the camels could travel easily. And so camel trains used to use the Way of the Wilderness here, even though there was less water and less rainfall and less fodder, because it was an easier route for camels to pass over. As they headed further south, they would have joined into the King's Highway. Now, the King's Highway is an area in Jordan which travels through mountains in its northern portion. And the route was there because it's an area of highest rainfall. And so the majority of biblical towns and archaeological sites in Jordan actually sit on the King's Highway. There was lots of farmland there, and it was well populated, so it wouldn't really have counted as wilderness per se. But when you get to the southern area, the southern portion, the rainfall here drops to less than 100 millimeters a year, and it's far less populated. And so heading onto the King's Highway there, we feel would still be considered travelling in the wilderness. This is the modern highway, which follows the route of the old highway across the Wadi Mojib. And in the bottom of here, there's an old Roman bridge, which marks the site of the old road. As we did this journey, we were able to gather a number of insights as well, which have been useful. I'm going to share just a few of them with you. We don't have time to share more than that. But one of the things that Nephi mentions as they travel is the fact his father dwells in a tent. And I had often wondered why he kept reminding us of this. One wondered if it was a way of showing that his father was some wealthy sheikh, some tribal leader or whatever. But as I was travelling in a place called Al-Lejun, near the way of the wilderness, I came across this tent and I thought, well, I'll take a photograph. And one of the things you have to know in Saudi Arabia when you take photos, it's a very quick way to get arrested. I wasn't sure what the rules were in Jordan. As I went to take a photograph of this tent, a woman came running out, shouting and screaming at me, and I thought, oh no, here we go again. And then her husband came out, and then she started shouting at him, and he ran in and got his gutra and his agal, and put them on and came out and stood there as smartly as he could to pose for this photo, which is very unusual for us. And as I walked past the tent, we began to talk a little bit of my kitchen Arabic and talk. As I walked past this tent, one of the things I couldn't help noticing was that everything he owned could have been wrapped up and put into just one of the boxes that I had on the back seat of my car. And this man, everything he owned wouldn't even have fitted on the seat of one of my cars. And I suddenly began to realize that as a Bedouin, this man was incredibly poor. And I think what Nephi is telling us here is that his father leaves his country estate, he leaves all of his wealth and lives as a poor man, and yet never do we hear him complaining about that. Laman and Lemuel certainly do, but at no point does Lehi complain about this sudden change in status. And this was one of those insights that came to me that was interesting, so I'm going to share that with you. Now, George, start presentation.
Now, one of the strengths that Richard and I have, and it's not degrees in archaeology, was the fact that we've lived combined in Saudi Arabia for almost 30 years. And we've traveled approximately 75,000 miles doing this research. So instead of us just talking right now, what I'd like to do is take you from the Gulf of Aqaba, where the King's Highway ends in the way of the wilderness, at the northern tip of Aqaba, where the wilderness is supposed to have started in those days. I'm going to take you down to the valley of Lemuel. We're going to take it there in video. Now, as Richard said, you cannot take except the tripod and full production. What you're going to see is made on a little Sony camera. But we're going to try to take you there.
The particular waste in which Lehi made his first camp is among the most uninviting deserts on earth. Detestable certainly describes the place. United States Geological Survey and Saudi Arabian Department of Water Resources concluded, Saudi Arabia may be the world's largest country without any perennial rivers or streams. Where is the fertile valley of Lemuel in a land described as hell? And where is its river of flowing water in riverless Arabia?
I became determined to find Lehi's trail to the river of Lehi. Let's start at the Gulf of Aqaba and use only the Book of Mormon as our guide.
Nephi's characteristics of the Valley of Lemuel. From what George had read in the Book of Mormon, he reasoned that the Valley of Lemuel must be a mountain canyon. Nephi wrote that the valley was in the borders, which meant the mountains. The Arabic word for mountain is Jebel, which conjugates in Hebrew as Jebel, which means the borders. The mountains in northwest Arabia are called the Hijaz, that literally means in English the barriers or borders. Nephi wrote that the valley was in the borders, meaning the valley was in the mountains. Since the valley of Lemuel was in the mountains, it must have been a canyon. Second, We knew that the valley had a small stream flowing continually through it. Nephi indicated that it was a river of water. Dr. Nibley clarified for us what this meant. Dr. Nibley notes, the expression river of water is used only for small local streams. The river of Laman must have been a small local stream, no name known to Lehi. It cannot, therefore, have been an important stream, let alone one of the most remarkable on earth, or Lehi would have known about it. Third, the valley of Lemuel opened onto the fountain of the Red Sea. The footnote in the Book of Mormon suggests it was on the Gulf of Aqaba, which is in the Red Sea. Fourth, the valley of Lemuel was very fertile. Nephi wrote that they gathered many kinds of fruits and even grain. However, Saudi Ministry of Agriculture has classified all the lands near the shore of the Gulf of Aqaba as 0% arable due to poor soil and rocky conditions. What instructions did Nephi give us for finding the valley of Lemuel? He wrote that they traveled in the borders. If we replace the term borders with mountains, we read, and he came down by the mountains near the shore of the Red Sea, and he traveled in the wilderness in the mountains, which are near the Red Sea. Note that Nephi first wrote that they traveled by the mountains, and then in the mountains. The mountains they traveled in were the mountains near the Red Sea. Nephi indicates that the wilderness they traveled in had two mountain ranges, both near the Red Sea. Indeed, this is exactly what is found in Midian, where there is one mountain range near the Red Sea and one near the Red Sea, with mountains ascending to over 6,000 feet. The valley of Lemuel was in the mountains near the Red Sea. Finally, Nephi wrote that they arrived at the river after traveling 3 days in the wilderness. In biblical times, the land known as the wilderness started near what is today the port of Aqaba at the northern end of the Gulf of Aqaba. Lehi could only have traveled in Arabia with tents and provisions if he had camels. A camel can travel between 20 and 25 miles per day, depending on load and terrain. This meant that their campsite by the river must have been somewhere between 60 and 75 miles from the northern end of the Gulf of Aqaba, and somewhere in the shoreline mountains. Does the trail Nephi described lead to a canyon with a stream? We were ready. The next morning we would follow Nephi's directions and see where they led us. As we traveled into Arabia, we found the terrain just as Nephi had described it, that they came down by the borders near the shore of the Red Sea. On our right were the waters of the Gulf of Aqaba of the Red Sea. Before us, excellent terrain for camels to travel, and on our immediate left were mountains. Nephi's initial instructions worked for about 45 miles. Then the passage along the shoreline ended. Here the mountains fall directly into the Red Sea. So what did Nephi say they did next? They traveled in the borders or mountains. We were not surprised then that the only wadi or valley into these mountains was found within a mile of where the mountains reached the sea. If we were on Lehi's trail, the prophet would have had only one choice, to enter this valley. But did this wadi lead to a river? We needed to see where this valley led, if anywhere. We were anxious on entering the wadi. If it failed any of our tests, it could not have been the one used by Lehi to reach the valley of Lemuel. First, it had to lead somewhere, either to a river or to another passage through the mountains. If it dead-ended, like most wadis do in this area, it meant that Nephi's instructions did not apply to this area. Second, We knew that the maximum distance Lehi could have traveled in 3 days was approximately 75 miles. This is only true provided they crossed good terrain for camels. If the terrain turned rocky, or the trail led over mountaintops, then 75 miles was way beyond their reach in 3 days. So far, the shoreline and this wadi would have provided a fast trail for camels. As the passage twisted its way through the mountains, we were amazed at how it kept a level course. However, we were afraid that around any bend, it might dead end. It didn't. It just kept going deeper and deeper into the mountains. By the time we reached the end of the wadi, we were 6 miles east into the mountains and 3 miles south from where we left the shoreline. The wadi proved to be a passage through the mountains to a rise where it opened into another wadi that headed south. George knew the shoreline mountains of Midian as a giant maze of intertwined mountains. Yet, here before us was a U-shaped wadi that led straight through the shoreline mountains. We learned later that the name of this valley was the Wadi Tayyib al-Ism. We headed down through the wadi to see where it led. We noticed 3 interesting characteristics of the Wadi Tayyib al-Ism. First, it had no exits. If Lehi entered this valley, he undoubtedly would have followed it to its end. Second, it provided an excellent footing for camels. Third, as we followed it down through the mountains, we were quickly coming to our limit of 75 miles, and what we were seeing was typical Midian landscape. No water, no vegetation to speak of, certainly no fruit trees. At this point, the wadi took a sudden turn to the west and headed for the tall shoreline mountains. Here, we expected the wadi to dead end. Instead, we found an oasis of date palms. The Arabs have a saying that the date palm has its feet in the water and its head in the fire. On seeing the palms, Lehi would have known that he had found a supply of water and food for his family. And how did we come upon this fertile valley? We followed exactly Nephi's instructions. However, the wadi did not end at the oasis. There is a great crack in the granite mountains that separates the oasis from the Red Sea, a canyon of pure granite. Within a few hundred yards of entering the canyon, we came to a true discovery, a springhead that fed a small desert river. Here was a stream of pure water flowing through a spectacular canyon formed from one of the hardest rocks on earth.
How do we know that the river flows all year round? I have visited the river 7 times, including the rainy season and in the driest part of summer. Once after heavy rain for 14 months.
And we're in the valley in which the river is found. It is named Sard Rand, one of the hardest rocks on earth. This valley can only be described as stern, steadfast, and immovable.
Lehi's family gathered seeds and fruits of many kinds, and also grain. Hundreds of date palms graced the canyon and the oasis in the upper valley. All 3 species of date palms are found in the valley. Delicious tea berries also grow in the canyon. Lehi's family could have collected other seeds and fruits in her. We found grain growing in the valley in 5 separate places. Is there any evidence that Lehi and his family stayed in this valley? Perhaps. On the north side of the oasis, just outside the canyon, is found the ruins of what appears to be a large permanent campsite. Lehi would have built windbreaks, storage areas, and tables and utility walls out of stone. Finding an antiquity site in the valley raised questions. Had archaeologists visited the site? What was it? And how old were these ruins? In search for the answers to these questions, George Potter traveled to Lemuel University of Petroleum and Minerals in Saudi Arabia. He knew that a team of international archaeologists had surveyed northwest Arabia in 1980, and with the help of Bedouin guides, had discovered almost 200 antiquity sites. George's research led him to the archaeological collection of the main library. Volume 5 of Saudi Arabian Archaeology had the information he needed. The ruins in the Wadi Tayyib al-Ism had been visited by the survey team in 1980. They had classified them as, quote, encampment, end quote, and cataloged them as archaeological site number 200-81. The archaeologists reported that they found surface artifacts at site 200-81, including stone enclosures, stone monuments, and pottery shards. We also found pottery shards at the encampment and questioned their age. The archaeologists classified the pottery at site as Iron Age, Median, and Hellenistic. They defined the Iron Age for this region as late 2nd to mid-1st millennium BC. We now knew that the campsite dated back to at least the top of Lehi. One other man-made feature caught the eye of Richard Wellington from England, a small stone box buried in the floor of the canyon.
So how would Lehi have traveled from the valley to southern Arabia where they built the ship? The answer to that question lies in understanding the economics of the period, the frankincense trade. The frankincense trees grew in southern Arabia by the shoreline in Oman and Yemen. At that time, their weight was worth more than their weight in gold. Caravans with thousands of camels in them would travel from the northern empires down to Oman to trade for the incense. And to support that trade, a trail or several trails were developed and supported. Now those who, the towns and villages that grew up along the trail and these halts became very wealthy supporting the trade. On the western side of Arabia, there's only one main trail from Dedan down to Yemen, and there are various branches off of it here to the north, one going to Babylon, one going up to Damascus, and one over here to Gaza. What interested us was the Gaza Trail, where that trail passed within 10 miles of the Valley of Lemuel. Now Jeremiah and Ezekiel wrote of the frankincense trade and named towns along that trail. Certainly Lehi, who appears to have been a merchant, would have known about that trail. Now we know that if Lehi had passed through Arabia, he would have had to have taken that trail. He could not have just wandered into Arabia. Why do we know that? Well, number one is water. He had to get access to water. And the reason the trail took that course was because that's where the aquifers were. That's where the wells were found. Now, Lehi could not have just wandered up to a well and started drinking. Those wells were protected by cowls or forts with garrisons. So, within a matter of days in Arabia, Lehi would have had to have gone there and to have gotten water. So people would have known about him. And he had to take the trail because that's where the water was. All the major oases in western Arabia are found along the trail. Food and fodder, supplies for the people and fodder for the camels, of course, were a necessity. At each of those called halts or villages, agricultural communities grew up to provide the food for the travelers on that trail. Again, they became very rich, sort of like the people who supplied 49ers in California. The Netherlands became wealthy during the gold rush. These people became very wealthy supplying caravans. And of course, fodder for the camels. Camels can go days without water, but they can only go a couple of days without food and then collapse. So they knew they could find the fodder at those halts. Also, the trail took the course the way it did because it avoided the mountains. Some might not realize that the camels cannot travel over mountains. They cannot travel over stand dunes. They have to have flat level courses. They're a very top-heavy animal, and the trail took the course for that reason. Just couldn't wander to Arabia because there are mountains there. Protection from bandits. Jeremiah wrote that the Arabs were notorious highway bandits, robbers. If they stayed on the trail, they'd receive the protection of the tribe as long as they paid tribute. And they'd also, of course, have the protection of being in the forts that were at the wells. And finally, they had to have taken the trail because, believe me, nobody wandered into those Arab countries at that time and just found their own route. Every Bedouin, as I have found, because I've been reported to the police a lot of times by the Bedouins, who have also treated me very well. Every Bedouin is a spy from the local tribe. Okay, if Lehi just wandered into Arabia, his whereabouts would have been known in a day. Arabia might be barren, but it's not unpopulated along these trails in that area of Arabia. Now, had Lehi been caught in a tribal land, his family would have been imprisoned, enslaved, the women and children, and he probably would have been executed, as we have many ancient accounts of that having happened. Now, one of the problems with doing our explorations of Lehi's trail is that no one apparently had ever tried to retrace the dozen branches of the Frankincense Trail. So we decided we would. That meant I went to the library, I did a lot of research on place names, ancient trail routes. I then gave those to Richard Wellington, who then took the distances and approximate trail routes and located the wells that currently exist, or I should say the wells, ancient wells that are currently known on maps. And he traced those onto TPC maps, which are used by pilots to navigate. And he then reckoned the GPS courses. The next step then was to actually go out into the Arabia and try to locate those. Look at TPC maps, see where the terrain went, and then try to plot where the trail would have been. And that's what we did with our GPSs. How do we know that we were correct? Well, we found all the killers, we found all the wells. So we're real pleased with that. We can't cover that. Because it was quite an accomplishment, actually. Now, is there any evidence in the Book of Mormon that Lehi took the Frankincense Trail because of branches of the Frankincense Trail? We think so. First of all, it says that they traveled in the borders through Nephi's account of the most fertile parts. And then you don't hear the borders anymore. And we know borders mean mountains. What you find here on the actual trail is that there are mountains at the beginning, and then after Medina, the trail left the mountains and never spoken of again. So Nephi's account is consistent with that. Next, Nephi talks about the fact that they're going through territory that is ever more declining in fertility. He writes about that they traveled many days and they came to the most fertile parts. Then they traveled many days and they came to the more fertile parts. And then they traveled many days and they had to stop and hunt for food. So apparently there was no cultivation in that area because they were left to hunt for their food. And this is precisely what you find along the Frankincense Trail. What Richard and I did, way there in the back, there's a bunch of little blue dots here that indicate where there's cultivation on the TPC maps. What we did is we took all the TPC maps for Saudi Arabia. These are the ones that pilots use. Everywhere it cited cultivation, we put a blue dot. And as you notice along the trail here, we're going from most fertile, more fertile to then places where there's no cultivation. In the northern part of the trail, there's an area cultivation for every 11 miles. From Medina down to Turba, there's only an area cultivation every 50 miles. And from Turba down to Najran, for every 162 miles. This indicates again a decline in fertility. If you take the shoreline route, you find it's just the opposite. You have more barren area here, and the fertility is only south. So that's consistent again with what we found along the terrain of the Gaza Branch at Frankincense Trail. And also the Book of Mormon names of Shazer and most fertile parts are still to be found along the trail today. Can't explain all that, would you? I tried Shazer.
Okay, thanks, George. If you remember, when they leave the valley, they travel in a south-southeast direction, travel for 4 days, and they find a place which Lehi calls Shazer. Shazer actually took us 2 years to be able to find, but once we found it, we wondered how we'd ever missed it. And what happened was we plotted all the wells around the area of the valley that would be in 4 days' distance and decided to visit them all. And this wasn't proving particularly fruitful until about the same time I started looking at work by Lois Musil, who is a Bohemian who travelled extensively in Norman Arabia. And George was looking at Dalal Wahabi's work on the trade routes of Arabia. And we found that they both mentioned a route at the same time. One of them, Ms. Musa's, is called the Al-Asifia, and the Al-Marika is named by Al-Wahabi, which both turn out to be names of the Gaza of the Frankincense Trail. And they mapped out where the stops were, and this enabled us to be able to look. And we noticed that Ayla is Izium Geber, it's Aqaba, northern end of the trail, which we know Lehi travelled on. The next town is Median, which is Al-Bada, which was only 18 miles from the valley. And we thought, well, if they went to Al-Bada, what would have been the next trail halt that they would have stopped in? And that was called Al-Agra. And so we looked at Al-Agra as a possible site for a Shazer. It's 60 miles from the valley. Now, you might say, well, why would it take 4 days if they could do 20 miles a day? But if you remember, they'd been in the valley for a long period of time. It appears they weren't given any warning to break camp. So we assume that would have taken them at least half a day to do, as they'd been dwelling there for quite a long period of time. And they would have to set up camp. So the journey could have taken place within a 4-day period and still be consistent with Nephi's account. Now, Shazer, we know, is in the borders near the Red Sea, so we're looking for a place which is still in the mountains. And let me just run over there in the trail. We've had them traveling in the wilderness. This is the wilderness of where John the Baptist preached, down the way of the wilderness, traveling to the valley here. And this is the Gaza arm of the Frankincense Trail. And so we think they would have headed here. And at this point is Al-Bada, or Midian, where Jethro was the high priest. And then the trail, which I'll show you some photos of in a moment, runs along the west side of the mountains and then takes a turn into the mountains just here. And this is where Al-Bagha was found. So this is Al-Bada. Obviously, these remains don't go back to Nephi's time, but this is where the water is scoured, and so it would have been where the town would have been in Lehi's time. And then you would leave Al-Bada and you would travel next to the mountains. There you can see here tents of Bedouins, and you get an idea of the size of the mountains from the tamarisk trees in the distance there. Now, we get a few clues as to what we're looking for when we find Shazer. Now, Shazer is, as a name, Groom tells us that Shazer means a valley or area abounding with trees or shrubs, and Nibbly refers to the same thing. Also, Shazer in Hebrew means twisting or intertwining. And this may give us a clue as to why Lehi calls the place Shazer. We were looking for a valley with trees. As you travel along next to the mountains, you come to a point where there's a valley that intersects your route. And I don't know if you can see there's some greenery there. You can begin to get the idea that there are some trees here. And as you move into the valley, into Wadi Aghar, as you look towards the sea, it's kind of burnt out slide, but it's the sea there. You see the trees heading off into the distance, and as you look towards the east, towards the mountains, you have the same thing. Musil describes at the beginning of the 20th century this oasis extended for 18 miles. So, and I don't know if you can see, but each side of the valley is actually quite close. It's a very narrow, thin valley. So it seemed to fit the description of the valley with trees extremely well. There's another thing. There's another town called Shazer on the Frankincense Trail down in Oman. And in Oman, Shazer means a cleft. And we're interested to find that Gar, which is where the name Wadi Aghar comes from, also means a cleft in the ground. So it may well be that Lehi was actually creating a very clever wordplay here, using Arabic and Hebrew to be able to explain the name for a valley which was intertwining, intersecting the route they were on, that was a valley with trees, and perhaps also included a play on words on the Arabic name for the valley they were travelling in. This is something you saw earlier. Could this have been where the trading halt was? This is showing archaeological sites in Midian. This is Wadi Tyre Balism here, with the Iron Age remains, where we think the valley was. This is Midian itself, and you can see the number of remains there. And you can see that, as it's named here, Wadi Asham is another name for Wadi Aghar, has by far the highest concentration of archaeological remains, many of which date back to the Iron Age, and so we know that this valley has been fertile for a very long period of time. We were able to find some of the archaeological remains there, which probably equated to the caravanserai that they would have travelled through. And one of the things you have to remember is we'll show you lots of pictures of the trees, and I don't want you to get the idea that Arabia is just full of trees. This is the standard terrain in Midian, and to find a valley with trees is extremely unusual. I'll just very briefly run over these because I know from the back I was sitting there, you can't read a thing of this size. But Nephi mentions a number of things in the text, and it was interesting to us that all of these things fit into what you find in that period of time in that area. He mentions, for example, when they get to Shazer, they go to hunt. And Agatha Knaidos mentions the fact that the people who live in that area, the Batnis Armenis, the people who lived in Wadi Ifal, which is where Midian is, and when we're right next to where Shazer is, that they lived by hunting land animals. And we were told by the Arabs that still the best hunting of ibex was found just there. And if you remember when Nephi is going back to bring back Ishmael's family, that Lemuel and Lemuel had enough and they tie him up to be eaten by wild animals. And Agatha tells us again that one of the disadvantages of having all of these animals to hunt was that he had so many wild animals, lions, wolves and pards, which is being translated elsewhere as panthers. And in fact, the last lion in Saudi Arabia was killed in Midian in 1926. So again, it fits perfectly in with the story that Nephi gives us.
Thank you, Richard. In fact, the only place on the TPC maps where it says trees is right there. Next, Nephi said they left Shazer and they traveled in the most fertile parts of the wilderness. Most fertile parts of Saudi Arabia? I mean, that just seems odd that Joseph Smith is a farmer. I think he would have used that word very selectively. This is the terrain that we went through for about 100 miles until we came to some halts. Now these halts start near the old town, Frankincense town of Dedan, and it's a chain of villages. They're about a day's travel by camel apart, and they form a ring like this. Along each of those villages, there's down a village and an agricultural area. Now, since Ramesses II, that area has been called Hagar, which means farms. We went to the Dictionary of Arabic Topography and Place Names by Nigel Broom, the expert on Arabian topography and place names. We found that there were some other spellings, alternative spellings, for Hajar. Each of those, he says, mean a fertile part of land. So that area is called a fertile part of land. Again, these are the villages that are along there. Here's some examples of some of those villages that you come across, which is rather shocking when you travel through hundreds of miles of desert and all of a sudden you come across these wonderful agricultural areas. Now, what I found of most interest is that Prophet Muhammad in the 6th century referred to this area with one of these place names, in the plural, which are in, which literally meant the fertile parts of land. He also applied a special tax, an additional quarter tax on those villages because they were the most fertile areas in all of his empire. It's easy to see why Nephi would describe that part of the trail as the most fertile parts.
Howie, wait on you. Time to wind it up.
Okay. We don't have time to go through all of this in too much detail. We apologize. It was amazing to us over a 6-year period as we traveled this, how so many of the things that Joseph Smith spoke about and wrote about in the Book of Mormon actually are there. So I'm going to have to ask you to believe me here. When I head down to the very end of the trail, and I'm just going to run through this so you can kind of get an idea of some of the things that we would love to be able to talk to you about, and you are more than welcome to read about in the book, which is at the back of the room. And if you'll just excuse me, I'll get us down to the very end here. Now, what we did is we looked at all of the statements that were made. I'll tell you what, George, while I'm talking, can you just get into the direct final portion? We looked at all of the statements that were made in the Book of Mormon by Nephi, geographical assertions, a river in a valley, the valley being firm, steadfast, and immovable, all the kind of things that if Joseph Smith were making up the book, I want you to use if Joseph Smith were making up this story, where it'd be very easy to prove him wrong. And we decided that we would try and work out what the odds would be of Joseph Smith guessing this, because this is one of the arguments that's been placed against the Book of Mormon since virtually its publication, was that it was an object of Joseph Smith's imagination. So let me ask you, what do you think the chances are of Joseph Smith, who had never been to Arabia, guessing that there was a continually flowing river in Arabia? What chance would you give him? One in a million, I heard some of you say. Depends on
whether he read Herodotus. He mentions a river running into the Red Sea in Arabia in his day.
Okay, so here we come. We've got somebody who says, well, Joseph Smith obviously could read ancient Greek, but didn't tell anybody.
Now learn English in Joseph Smith's day.
Okay.
Was it in Manchester Library?
So it has to be in Joseph Smith's area, and he has to be able to go and do this. And he has to also know that the river is in a valley, which Herodotus doesn't mention, which is firm, steadfast, and immovable. And there are a number of other things he has to get in order. And we can say that maybe he can guess some of these. Maybe you can guess some of these. And we're saying 1 in a million. How about 50-50? Would that be fair to you, Joseph Smith, to guess that? Would you say?
I don't think he read the writings. I'm just saying it was.
Okay, well, let's say he had a coin in his pocket, and every time he made a statement, he tossed the coin, and he, heads he was right, and tails he was wrong. He guessed Shazer as a name, and tails he didn't get Shazer. That's fair enough, isn't it? So, what we get to is, and this is the Hubble Deep Field picture, and we're going to come on to that in a moment. What were Joseph Smith's chances of guessing this? There were 81, okay, thanks for reminding me. We counted 81 assertions that Nephi made, physical assertions, and we were claiming that we found, and we hope we have photographs for you, 80 of those. The only thing we didn't find was Ishmael's grave, but we think we can put you to about 2 miles from where it probably was, with a name, Nihon, to this day in Yemen, about 2 miles from the Frankincense Trail. These are the kind of assertions that we've spoken about. And not only do they have to be there, but you have to have them in the right order, with the right names, the right directions, the right distances, and they have to be fitting in with 7th century BC Arabia. Well, 50-50, what are the chances? By the time Joseph Smith reached Shazer, his chances would be about 1 in 8 million of guessing that. By the time you get to mayhem, you're talking about 1 in, I don't know, it's 140 trillion, something like that. By the time you get to Bountiful, the number's getting too big for me to be able to say, and by the time they sail away to the Americas, Joseph Smith's chances of guessing here are pretty large. That can be written as 2.5 septillion can be written by 2.5 times 10 to the 24. Well, what does that mean? When numbers get that big, it's kind of difficult to say. So let's go back to the Hubble Deep Field picture. That's a part of Ursa Major. There aren't any stars, which from the sky equates to about the size of the eye. Was it President Roosevelt? Held at arm's length. So this is the kind of size of sky we're looking at. Okay, sorry, it's foreign money to me. Is this a nick? No, it's a dime. Now, sorry. It's a dime held at arm's length. That's the size of sky we're talking about. Pretty small piece of sky. And the reason they chose there are no stars is they could look out at our galaxy and elsewhere. And one of the things you'll notice, could we have the light down? Because this is kind of dim. Thanks very much. Is that what we're looking at here is a whole series, not of stars, but of galaxies. And so now it's felt that if you look anywhere in space, you would see that many galaxies, that kind of density and concentration of galaxies. And it's felt that there are 10 to the 9 galaxies now that we can see, and each of those is considered to have 10 to the 9 stars. So that makes 2.5 times 10 to the 19 stars of the universe. Now, if you imagine then that we have a laser pointer, and this big sister here, and I go out and we can see the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, and we close our eyes and we both point into space, the chances of you and I actually pointing to the same star in the same galaxy in either the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere are 100,000 times more likely than Joseph Smith being able to guess these 81 points in order, giving him 50-50 chance. And I think we've already seen from some other people they feel 50-50 is probably more than fair. And so we would suggest then that it may well be, and we certainly believe that what we read in verse Nephi is in fact a first-hand account of somebody who in the 7th century BC actually travelled from Jerusalem to Dophar on a long trail which was known to exist at that time, and describes the things they see. And if you'd like to see them for yourself and read a little more detail, then we'd refer you to the book at the back. Thank you very much.